We are live outside the New York City courthouse where Donald Trump's first criminal trial is underway. Moments ago, they just took a break for lunch. They have been inside that courtroom for several hours, but no actual jurors have yet been brought inside the room as they are still arguing over stuff that happens before the trial gets officially underway, what evidence can be argued, whether or not Donald Trump has violated his gag order. As you know, we've spent a lot of time outside this Manhattan courthouse where Donald Trump is going to be spending the next 6 to 8 weeks. Today is especially loud. As you can hear, some of his supporters are out here, some of his detractors are over to our left. Obviously, a lot of members of the media, as this has fueled intense coverage given its historic nature. It is the first criminal trial of a former president to ever be held. And so we are watching all of this. And Paula, right before we got into this break, what prosecutors are asking the judge to do here is to fine Donald Trump for violating his gag order.
That's right. They're pointing to 3 posts that he has made, at least one of which he refers to Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, potentially 2 key witnesses in this case, as, quote, sleazebags. And here the prosecutors are asking for him to be fined $1,000 for each post, and also asking the judge to warn Trump, remind him that if he continues to violate this gag order, he could be held in contempt. Now, the judge has not yet ruled on this motion, and of course we are in a break, but this is going to be an issue that will likely come up pretty much every day.
And we are joined outside this courthouse by Judge Jill Konviser, a former New York State Supreme Court justice who is also friends with Judge Merchan. That is the judge overseeing this case. That Trump has tried unsuccessfully time and time again to recuse himself from this case. And Judge, it's great to have you here, especially just given your knowledge of Judge Merchan, because he has, intense impact on shaping what this is going to look like. And right now on day one, he's being faced with this decision. Did Donald Trump violate this gag order, and how does he respond? If so, he's deciding clearly after the lunch break. How do you think he's weighing this?
Well, I think that Juan Merchan is in a great position to be the judge in this particular case because of the depth of his experience. People look at the Trump case very carefully and under a microscope because, for obvious reasons, but it is quite loud here. But obviously, Juan Merchan for 15 years has handled difficult defendants before, and dealt with defendants who have acted out in courtrooms, defendants who are alleged murderers, rapists. This is what we do. It is the landscape in which we toil. So I don't think this is a huge lift for Juan Merchan, for Judge Merchan. I do think, however, that if it were me, certainly I would warn the defendant again. Doing a contempt proceeding at this point will slow everything down. It doesn't really benefit anyone.
I have to get your perspective on something that also Trump has just been arguing that he wants to do, which is when there are those sidebars between the judge and the prosecutors and Trump's defense team, Trump wants to be able to approach the bench. How unusual is that?
That's entirely unusual. I would never allow it. The defendant in any criminal case is entitled to hear any of those sidebar conversations if they involve issues for which the defendant could give input. So if it's strictly legal, the defendant has no right to be there. But if it's anything with a factual basis, the defendant does have a right to be there. And logistically, I think that's a challenge for Judge Merchan to make sure that the defendant has that opportunity, if it means clearing the courtroom or going in the back, as we often do. Logistically, again, it's hard here because you have Secret Service, you have court officers, and a lot of lawyers. So that makes it a little more complicated.
Well, and what happened right before this break happened? And I should note, just you were mentioning how loud it is here. I mean, it is kind of a circus down here. It's really the most generous way to describe it. It's always a little bit crazy. Paul and I have spent a lot of time down here. Today feels especially more so. I mean, some of his former supporters are just circling the courthouse, really, as he is inside. He just left without speaking. But one thing the judge was just doing was reading Trump his rights and telling him that if he disrupts this trial, that the judge has the right to exclude him and even potentially jail him if that happens. What's the threshold for something like that?
Well, that's a good question. Every defendant has a right to be present at their own trial. That right is fundamental, but it is not absolute. In other words, if a defendant, by their conduct, cannot follow the rules of the courtroom, cannot follow the rules of the staff in the courtroom, speaks out over the judge, a defendant can forfeit their right to be present. And if the defendant continues to do that, I would say he would find himself in a bit of trouble. Judge Merchan is not going to tolerate it. He is a consummate professional. He is a fair and just jurist, and he will do everything he can to ensure that the defendant gets the fair trial to which he is entitled. And if that includes taking him out of the courtroom because he destroys the process or infects it deleteriously, he will do that. And warning the defendant is the only standard. If the defendant knows and persists, he can be waltzed out, not to return. He can be jailed too. We'll see if that happens.
How would you describe how Judge Merchan is in the courtroom? We don't have cameras in there, so we can't actually see what it looks like. We just see sketches, pictures. We get our dispatches from our team. How would you describe it to someone who's sitting at home and is curious what it's actually like in the room?
I would say that it's probably not quite the circus in there that it is out here. There's a certain amount of decorum that's required. There's a lot of people in that courtroom and a lot of static, I'm sure. But when the judge is on the bench and speaking, everyone needs to take notice and pay attention. When the jurors walk in, they will show the appropriate respect for the courtroom. Everyone needs to do that. It's much like something that you would see on TV. That's very... a lot of people in the jury box, a lot of people in the courtroom, and everyone in their position. Judge Merchan is not a hothead. He's not a screamer. He is, as I said, a professional. He takes this very seriously. I don't think he's going home losing sleep at night over this case. I just don't. I'm sure he's focused on it because there's a lot of work involved and a lot of scrutiny, but he handles a lot tougher defendants.
Yeah.
I have confidence in him.
The Trump team tried to get him bounced from this because he said it was intense preparation. Clearly, we all know that. That is one thing that everyone can agree on. Judge Konfiser, great to have you joining us here outside the courthouse.
This is so important, isn't it, Ellie? Because this is really what we were talking about before, about what's going to happen here with this judge. Yep. The gag order, this is before a jury is impaneled. They're obviously on top of mind about what impact it could have on them. Will they be threatened? Will they be intimidated in some way or insulted?
This is one of the first moments of truth for Judge Merchan, who, of course, will be front and center throughout this trial. Now, Judge Merchan was a prosecutor long ago in his career. He's been a judge in New York for 17 years now. He's generally quite widely respected. He's described by people who've appeared in front of him as efficient and fair and in charge of his courtroom. Now, before this,
he's not unknown.
Yeah, he is not unknown, nor are they unknown to him.
Right.
He presided over a trial of the Trump Organization for tax fraud, separate issue, but he knows a lot of the players here, and he presided over the prosecution of Allen Weisselberg, who pled guilty in that case. Now, of course, the judge, as recently as this morning, has denied various motions by Donald Trump to recuse himself, to remove himself off the case based on his daughter's political activity. And as you said, the judge has issued this limited gag order that Donald Trump, we discussed in the beginning of this show, appears to have violated over the weekend, and now the DA is asking the judge to take action on that.
One thing that is a possibility for the average defendant, if you violate the orders of release or, of course, a gag order, could be to be stepped back. Not likely to happen here at all.
Yeah, he's not going to get locked up,
Step back,
but he may get fined.
Let's see what else. Now we have the defense, though, and who's on this team. This is important. They're making these motions. You've worked with Todd Blanchard before.
Todd Blanchard was a colleague of mine for several years, federal prosecutor at the Southern District of New York. He was in charge of the Violent Crimes Unit. Very experienced trial lawyer. This is a challenge unlike one he's seen before. And he'll be aided by Susan Nichelis, who is a very experienced, also long ago a prosecutor, but a very well-known, very respected defense lawyer. By the way, put aside your notions of the sort of flamboyant Trump lawyers of the past. This is no Rudy. This is no Sidney Powell. They're both experienced courtroom operators. They're tacticians. Todd, if anything, is soft-spoken. It's sort of understated. So he doesn't fit the classic mold of the Trump defense attorney.
Remind people, though, in terms of who is going to lead in the sense of, does Trump direct his attorneys or do the attorneys direct them on issues of fact or legal strategy?
Well, we say attorneys can only advise,
yes,
right? You can't force, so that will be a dynamic that we'll be watching throughout.
Well, let's talk about who's actually going to prosecute this case. Obviously, Alvin Bragg is the DA. He himself will not argue this case, which is very typical.
Yeah, just to show you what a small world that is, I also worked with Alvin Bragg at the Southern District of New York, as did Todd Blanchard. So they know each other. They were colleagues before. Alvin Bragg is the district attorney, took office in early 2022. He will not be trying the case. He'll probably show up in the courtroom to support his team. His team is extraordinarily experienced in the courtroom. Susan Hoffinger will be leading the charge for the DA's office. She has been in that office for over 25 years, tried many, many cases.
Matthew Colangelo, though, has been an issue for this Trump team.
Yeah, when you hear Donald Trump wrongly say this is a Biden prosecution, what he's pointing to, and it's an incredibly weak argument, is that Matthew Colangelo was at DOJ a few years ago, but there is no evidence, no known connection between the Biden administration and this case.